The history of Asian and Pacific Islanders in the United States is really a story of immigration. It began back in 1882 with the introduction of the Chinese Exclusion Act. This act was actually the first immigration legislation passed that restricted immigration on the basis of race and national origin. The act played on and spurred on the racism and fear, especially in California, about Chinese immigrants taking especially mining jobs. In 1917, Congress passed the Immigration Laws Act, prohibiting immigration from persons who are native of islands not possessed by the United States adjacent to the continent of Asia. Notably, there were exceptions to this for lawyers, physicians, chemists, and all other manner of white-collar workers. Additionally, this act created literacy tests, effectively barring poor and uneducated workers from entering the country. By the start of World War II, over 120,000 Japanese Americans were living in the United States, 2/3 of whom were citizens. But with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, suspicions turned towards them. Faced with pressure from scared citizens and military leaders alike, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, allowing the War Department to proceed with the internment of Japanese Americans. It took almost 3 years for the administration to end this act and release the citizens that remained. During this time, over 5,500 Japanese Americans renounced their citizenship in protest. Additionally, Japanese Americans lost nearly $400 million in property, often seized due to their absence. Despite this unjust imprisonment, Japanese Americans did fight in the U.S. military, one such group being the 442nd Regiment of the United States military. About 18,000 Japanese American soldiers fought in Italy and France, and their regiment became the most decorated in war history, with over 4,000 Purple Hearts awarded. It took until 1988 for President Ronald Reagan to formally apologize for the internment and to provide reparations. There were legal challenges to the internment camps. The case Korimatsu versus the United States saw Fred Korimatsu arrested and convicted of violating the military order to report to internment camps. Twice convicted in lower courts, he, along with the ACLU, appealed to the Supreme Court, where in a 6-3 split decision, they upheld the lower court's rulings. The majority argument was that the order Fred had violated was legal. As though it applied specifically to a specific ethnicity of people, it was considered a military necessity for the safety of the United States, and thus was legal. Later, the case was overturned in federal court, but it still stands today in the Supreme Court as case law. On the very same day as the Korimatsu ruling, the Supreme Court walked back their position somewhat with the Ex parte Endo case. They ruled that if a person was conceitedly loyal, they could not be held in an internment camp and must be released. This case was substantially different, as it did not argue that the executive order that initially allowed the internment camps was illegal, but that the permanent holding of them after they had been proven loyal was. This came about as late in the internment process, many Japanese Americans took loyalty questionnaires where they had to declare their loyalty and say that they were willing to fight in the U.S. military. This case led to the shutting down of most internment camps, with a notable exception of Tule Lake, which housed Japanese Americans who were deemed disloyal. In 1952, the McCarran-Walter Act revised the idea of national immigration quotas. The previous system of restricting immigration visas on the basis of race was replaced with a quota system on the basis of national origin. An individual with one or more Asian parents born anywhere in the world and possessing citizenship of any nation would be counted under the national quota of the Asian nation of his or her ethnicity, or against a generic quota for the Asian Pacific Triangle. This law passed despite a presidential veto and became law on June 27, 1952. Another major milestone in the assimilation of Pacific Islanders came in 1959 when Hawaii became a state. The process began in the 1980s and 90s when white farmers forced the reigning monarchs of Hawaii out of power. The first major step was in 1940 when Hawaii citizens voted on the matter of statehood. This vote passed with a supermajority. A further 2 votes were held in similar fashion, both passing overwhelmingly. After a long process through the House and Senate, and presidential vetoes, Eisenhower signed a bill making Hawaii the 50th state. Recognizing the failures of the McCarran-Walter Act, Congress and President Johnson passed the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. This removed national quotas, placed a total cap on visas, and allowed for family immigration outside of this cap. The bill was written to promote immigration from high-skilled workers, but in reality it opened the door to hundreds and thousands of Asian immigrants taking advantage of the Family Reunification Clause. Here we see how the population of Asian Americans skyrocketed in the years following this act. The struggles of Asian Americans continue today. The racism that has interweaved history has not gone away. It simply has taken different forms. Recently, during COVID, hate crimes against people of Asian descent have skyrocketed. In response to this uptick of hate crimes, state and federal governments have passed laws to support Asian Americans. The United States Senate has passed a bill to expedite the review of hate crimes against Asian Americans. There are still many advocacy groups working to represent Asian Americans in the United States. Historically, the Japanese American Citizen League has been a major force for fair representation, reparations, and equal treatment of Japanese people in the U.S. The history of Asian Americans in the United States is one marked with injustices, restrictions on liberty, and institutional racism. There's still a culture of distrust against people of Asian American heritage. Work is being done to fix past and current wrongs, but like many aspects of American culture,